Hi, hello, welcome to a Physionic detailed study analysis or full study analysis. Today we're going to be going over GLP-1 agonists, which are the semaglutide, liraglutide, and all these different Wegovy and Ozempic drugs that people have been taking for weight loss and diabetes. So we're going to go over a number of studies. We're going to go over, I think, 5 or 6 studies to determine the effect that they have on our health. So I've got other content specifically looking at weight loss and fat loss and whatnot. I'll be touching on that as well in this video. However, the main focus is going to be looking at a number of different health indices. So if you're interested in actually seeing the science and understanding the mechanisms behind these drugs, then you're in the right place. That said, if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and this is what I do. I take studies, I compile studies together, I analyze them, and then I make them available so that you can watch at your own leisure and critique at your own leisure so you can actually see the data for yourself and determine if you agree or maybe potentially disagree with my take. Either way, if you don't want to go through the entire study analysis, you can jump to the conclusion sections where you'll get a quick summary of my overall perspective, overall points, overall takeaways from all these studies combined, but you will be missing out on a great deal of detail that can only be gotten from actually going through the full study analysis. That said, let's go ahead and jump into this. All right, so here we are. We're going to go over the mechanisms of action. We'll go over GLP-1 agonists on blood sugar, blood pressure, and several other indices of health. And I'm also going to be going over GLP-1 agonists for all-cause mortality. I'll be going over relative risk as well as absolute risk. And then for the insiders, if you're part of the insider program, insider community, which you can find linked to this video, we'll also be going over in the full version of this video how they affect heart disease specifically, so a number of different indices of heart disease, fatty liver disease, kidney function, as well as inflammation, oxidative stress. So if you're interested in getting the full version of this video, just hop on over and join the Physionic Insiders and you'll get access to this, plus many, many other of my full study analyses and much more. Okay, so let's move forward. Mechanisms of action. The mechanisms of action, they're not coming off the top of my head. They are coming from this scientific review. So I couldn't find the funding source. There were some conflicts of interest, which if you're interested in actually seeing more details on all that, I have a document that's linked so that you can read through it and see if these conflicts of interest are in some way nullifying for you, where you decide, this isn't worth it. I don't believe these scientists or whatever it might be. Whatever the reason is, I've got the conflicts of interest, the more details on them listed in that document so you can check them out. But unknown funding, and there are conflicts of interest for study 226. And all these studies have particular numbers attached to them so that you can easily find them in the document, supplied document. All right, so let's go over this. So let's discuss GLP-1 before we get to the actual drugs. So the drugs are a mimetic of GLP-1. So GLP-1 is Glucagon-like peptide, and it is released by our intestinal cells, specifically the L cells that we find here. So here we've got our intestine. So if we were to kind of look down at our intestine and then zoom into our intestine, we would see something like this. If that's the jejunum, the duodenum, or the ileum, whatever, it doesn't really matter, as long as they have L cells built into the wall of the epithelial layer, the intestine epithelium. So all these cells make up the barrier between the inside of the intestines right here and the bloodstream. So they have to create this barrier. And you've probably heard of leaky gut syndrome. Well, that's usually when you have the opening between these different cells. But what we're more focused on in this situation is looking at the L cells. So the L cells get stimulated by food consumption to then release GLP-1, so this glucagon-like peptide, which is an incretin hormone, meaning that it comes from our stomach or it comes from our intestinal tract. So it gets released into the bloodstream, and if we have food consumption. Now, one of the things that it does is that it binds to our pancreas. And how it works is that GLP-1 will bind to a receptor, so a GLP-1 receptor on the pancreas. So this is a pancreatic beta cell. So that's a particular area of the pancreas called the pancreatic beta islets. And these cells, so we've got outside of the cell here, we've got inside of the cell here, we've got the cell membrane here. GLP-1 is bound to the receptor. And there's certainly much more complexity than just a single arrow going to this insulin molecule. There's going to be a cascade of different molecules that interact with one another to essentially ultimately lead to the production of insulin from typically the immature form of insulin, which is called proinsulin. So proinsulin gets cleaved into the full mature insulin molecule, and then it gets secreted out. Now, obviously, when GLP-1 is not present, then we don't get the secretion of insulin. Now, insulin secretion is not solely dependent on GLP-1, just to be clear, but the role of GLP-1 is to, or one of the roles, is to increase insulin secretion. So that's one of the ideas as to why GLP-1 is then seen as this drug, or in this situation, the hormone, in that it has a specific benefit to people with diabetes that may not be able to produce enough insulin. Well, this hormone will encourage the production of more insulin to regulate blood sugar in the bloodstream, because all this insulin ends up in the bloodstream. Now, what's cool here is, I'll quick mention this, is that GLP-1, when it binds, the release of insulin from the pancreas is actually also dependent on the amount of blood sugar that's present. So if you were to, which is a fascinating mechanism, that if you were to take GLP-1, as we're going to be talking about with the drugs, right, these mimetics of GLP-1, if GLP-1 were to bind to the exterior of the cell and blood sugar is not elevated, you would not see that much insulin release. So it's kind of an incredible fail-safe mechanism that you don't see this sudden rush of insulin being dumped into the bloodstream, because if you don't have high enough blood sugar, then the normal blood sugar levels will crash and you become hypoglycemic, which can obviously be extremely detrimental. It can lead to a seizure and can potentially lead to death. So your body is so well designed that it has this feedback mechanism between insulin, blood sugar, and GLP-1. So GLP-1 is not sufficient to have the release of insulin. It's not even, I would say, necessary, but it is this additional ancillary mechanism that allows for greater insulin release when blood sugar is elevated. So when blood sugar is elevated and GLP-1 binds, then you get additional insulin release. I just want to make that clear, because it's just this incredibly cool mechanism. And it speaks to, it might get rid of some of the doubts that people have in terms of, well, if I take this, then my blood sugar will crash. Well, no, it'll bind, but it won't do anything because there's not enough blood sugar. There has to be a requisite amount of blood sugar. And that blood sugar is sensed by the pancreas cells by these receptors, or these transporters that dig themselves into the membrane and allow blood sugar in, which then changes the ATP levels, or the cell energy levels within the cell. And that leads to a cascade that leads to a triggering of insulin production and insulin release. Another thing that GLP-1 does, so that was the kind of common pathway that people talk about. So GLP-1 binds to the pancreas and leads to the release of insulin. Now, another thing that it does, and this is a really rudimentary drawing of it, but here we've got our stomach. So this would be the esophagus up here. We've got the esophageal sphincter, which is a closed off section that closes anytime that you consume food. And then you have the stomach, which would typically be filled with stomach acid and a lining of cells and all that stuff. So when you have food in the stomach, you have stretch. You have this, well, you have stretch receptors as well, but you have this stretching of the stomach, which also sends signals to the brain to indicate we are full. Okay, so those are the stretch receptors that allow for that whole process to occur. Now, one way that we can modulate that through GLP-1 is that GLP-1 will bind to stomach cells and actually slow down the opening of this lower sphincter. So you can see that it's kind of closed off here, and it would be tightly closed. So it has to open for the contents to then fall from the stomach into the actual intestine itself, because the stomach is above the intestines. So GLP-1, when it binds to the stomach cells, what happens is that it leads to the further closing of what's known as the pyloric sphincter, which is this one right here. So we've got esophageal sphincter, we've got the pyloric sphincter. This one is certainly very important for like heartburn. If you've ever felt heartburn when you've eaten a lot of food, that's because the esophageal sphincter is starting to get in contact with some of that stomach acid, which it really feels awful. But what we're talking about here in the feeling of fullness, GLP-1 can increase our feeling of fullness because it binds to the stomach and therefore slows the opening of the pyloric sphincter. Therefore, the food stays in our stomach for longer, and we get these stretch receptors that are continuously telling our brain, oh, we're full for longer. So that's one additional advantage of GLP-1. So you can see that it already has two mechanisms, but that's not the only thing that it does, actually. So another mechanism, and keep in mind, this is all from this scientific review, so you're welcome to check it out for yourself. But another mechanism that it has is that GLP-1 can actually bind to intestinal cells, L cells, so the same ones that actually produce it, and can lead, and GLP-1 can also be produced, of course, by these L cells and can bind to neurons, so these are nerve cells, that extend from the intestine to the pancreas. So these neurons will then translate a signal from the intestines, which are obviously not they're not part of the pancreas. The pancreas isn't part of the intestines. So there's no way for them to communicate except for obviously hormones, and which we saw with GLP-1. So GLP-1 actually directly binding to the pancreas, or it can have an effect through these neurons. So these neurons will extend all the way to the pancreas and then lead to the release of molecules that will bind to the pancreas and then lead to the release of more insulin. So now we've got three different mechanisms by GLP-1 leads to greater release of insulin. And again, all this stuff is very tightly regulated. So some of it gets shut down if we don't have enough blood sugar, just to be clear. This is another schematic for it, so you can just see where the pancreas is. It's all the way back here. We've got our intestines back here. And then you would have this neuron that would extend from the intestines all the way up to the pancreas to then release insulin, just to give you an idea of where these things are located. And now finally, I do want to discuss in a little bit more depth the effect that GLP-1 has on the brain. So we've gone over three mechanisms. This fourth one is probably, to me, the most fascinating. And it's one that I described in my weight loss video as well, but I'd like to go into more depth here because the way that it does it is wickedly cool, just super cool. So we've got our brain here, and if we were to zoom in to what's a section called the hypothalamus, you could ignore the pituitary gland, but if we were to zoom into a section called the hypothalamus, GLP-1 will actually bind to the hypothalamus. And here, what it does is it actually binds to POMC neurons. These POMC neurons will lead to the release of molecules that inhibit food intake. So they inhibit, or they increase satiety. They inhibit what are known as orexigenic, that's always really difficult for me to say, orexigenic hormones, meaning that they inhibit the production of hormones that would lead to greater food consumption. And on the other hand, what GLP-1 also does is it binds to NPY-AGRP neurons. Now, these NPR just stands for neuropeptide Y, and these are agouti-related peptide neurons. These will release these molecules, NPY, so neuropeptide Y, and release AGRP. These are proteins that then can be released and can lead to greater food intake. But what GLP-1 does is it actually binds to these neurons and inhibits them. Now, I'd like to describe to you exactly how it does this, which is something I've never gone over before, but it was covered in this review, and I thought it was just so fascinating that I thought I'd share. It doesn't just bind and then poof, things happen. There's a very particular mechanism that occurs. Okay, so when we think of a neuron, let me go back here real quick. Let's look at these. Let's take an example of these NPY AGRP1 neurons. Let's say a single neuron, GLP-1 binds to this single neuron. Okay, so typically when you have the activation of a neuron, what happens is you have sodium that's outside. You have high levels of sodium that are outside relative to the amount of potassium that's inside. So we've got outside the neuron, we've got inside the neuron. And then we've got the neuron membrane right here, which actually creates the separation between the two. Now, sodium, because there's so much more sodium outside of the neuron than there is inside the neuron is actually very negative. Like as in the neuron potential, what's known as the neuron potential, is extremely negative because the outside is so positive. So everything is relative. So outside, because sodium is a positive ion, you can see Na+, so potassium is also positive, but there's so much more sodium outside that the sodium outside makes things outside so positive that if you were to measure the inside relative to the outside, it would be so negative. And that's what we see here. And we don't mean personality-wise, we're talking about the actual polarization of the neuron. So here's 0. So if we were to measure, actually use a probe and measure the inside of the neuron, we would see the membrane potential is 0 here. So this would be completely neutral. It would be not positive, it would not be negative. But you can see that normally the membrane potential is extremely negative for the reason that I explained. So it's -70. Now, when different molecules bind to the neuron, they can influence the neuron to become more positive or more negative. And this is where we start to get the effect of GLP-1. But to explain this a little bit further, if you reach what's known as a threshold potential, which is roughly -55, and it depends on which cells you're talking about, but in this situation, we're talking about neurons. So it's -55. If we were to reach -55, as in like we would get just a little bit of sodium into the cell, which leads to an increase from -70 to -55, which means it becomes more positive, then suddenly everything opens. The whole neuron just activates. It has to reach this threshold. If it doesn't reach this threshold, it will not activate. But if it reaches the threshold, then it will activate, or what's known as depolarize, which is this. So it suddenly becomes really positive. It goes up to 40 millivolts. It becomes very positive, and what's known as an action potential occurs. So this whole neuron will suddenly activate and send a signal from one part of the neuron, the beginning part of the neuron, to the end part of the neuron and propagate that signal onto the next neuron. So that's how we send signals from neuron to neuron. And then it goes through what's known as a repolarization, where it drops back down to a negative. And instead of going straight back to its -70, what it goes through is a refractory period where it goes hyper negative or hyperpolarized, and it goes down to like -90, for example. And then it'll slowly re-equilibrate back up to this resting state. Now, I'm not going to go into all the dynamics of sodium, potassium pumps and all that stuff. That stuff doesn't really matter for this. The point is that if you have the activity of something, you can change where the neuron maintains its membrane potential. Is it closer to this threshold and then therefore more likely to be active, or is it further down, or is it more hyperpolarized where it's maybe -80 or -90, where it's harder for the neuron to then become active? And hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. GLP-1 can bind to the neuron, and if we were to, let's say we're talking about, remember, it's inhibiting the NPY AGRP neurons. What we see is that when GLP-1 binds to the neuron cell, to the neuron membrane, it's the same thing, neuron cell, same thing. Neuron is a particular type of cell. Then we see a drop in the membrane potential. So now it goes from 70 where it was to minus 90. Now it becomes more difficult for this grouping of neurons to then activate and therefore encourage food intake. You see the connection here? Now, on the other hand, what it also does is when it binds to the POMC neurons, which you want them to be active so that they can inhibit food intake. And these actually cross-pollinate with one another. They can actually cross-talk with one another, where POMC neurons can regulate and reduce the activity of NPY, AGRP neurons. So in that situation, when GLP-1 binds, what it does is it increases the baseline resting membrane potential to, let's say, from minus 70 to like minus 65. I'm just spitballing here. And therefore, it becomes more likely to become active and therefore inhibit food intake. So I thought that was super, super cool. I thought I would share. Okay, so this is all stuff related to GLP-1, but I want you to think that this also all applies to GLP-1 agonists. So the actual, the drugs themselves are the structure of the drug, semaglutide, liraglutide, all those are just slight chemical alterations to the actual structure of the normal natural hormone that we produce. So it might be a slight shift of like one bond or the addition of a carbon or the addition of, whatever chemical bond structure you want to change, a hydrogen, a hydroxyl group, whatever it is. I'm not a chemist. But if a chemist were to look at it, or a biochemist, they'd be able to determine, okay, these are the differences between the natural version versus the drug version, which is usually pretty subtle so that it can still have all these effects. Remember, it has to bind to all these different receptors on the intestines, on the stomach, on the brain, all these different areas. And GLP-1 normally is degraded very quickly. And it gets degraded, so when we produce it, let me go back up here real quick. When we produce it from our L cells, it ends up in the bloodstream, and in the bloodstream, it can actually be degraded by these DPP enzymes, which essentially bind to GLP-1 and then degrade them into their constituent parts. And it happens within minutes. So when you consume food, you produce GLP-1, and then that GLP-1 gets degraded very quickly. Now, what scientists were thinking, and what the pharma industry and all the money that goes behind this, we're thinking, well, instead of making a completely new molecule, what if we take GLP-1, which has all these effects on satiety and all these different effects on the stomach and all these different areas that I just went over? Well, what happens if we then just slightly tweak it, and can we get it to have all of these effects that we just went over, as well as can we get it so that the DPP is far less sensitive to GLP-1 so that it doesn't bind and immediately degrade it? So DPP can potentially bind but is incapable of degrading it, or simply cannot bind it nearly as well. And it doesn't have to be on all or nothing. It doesn't have to be 100% binding or 0% binding. It can be, maybe it binds at 5% of the time, but that's still a 20x drop from what it would be if it were just regular GLP-1 produced by the body. So these GLP-1 agonists become far less sensitive. So DPP can then not bind nearly as well to GLP-1 agonists and therefore can't degrade them. So that means that the GLP-1 agonists then can stay in circulation for much longer. So those are the mechanisms by which, or some of the mechanisms, and I'll be going over a few more for the insiders. If you're interested in the full version, I'll be going over a few more mechanisms as well for those individuals. But these are several of the mechanisms by which GLP-1 and GLP-1 agonists then function. All right. Now that we've gone over the mechanisms, let's go over the actual effect that GLP-1 agonists, these drugs, have on different health markers. And for that, we're going to be relying on some of the longer term effects of GLP-1 agonists. Because one of the critiques of GLP-1 agonists, for example, is what effect it has, long term. So I believe that this study analysis, which is a meta-analysis of multiple studies, limited things. So they only accepted studies that had to be at least 1 year or longer. So some of the studies were several years long of people continuously taking these GLP-1 agonists. So it's study 223. It is public funding, so there's no pharmaceutical input or anything like that. There's no industry funding whatsoever and no conflicts of interest. But still, I'll post the actual public funding source in the document as with the others. All right, so let's go over the study design here. They went through roughly 39,000 studies or trials, and they ended up eliminating a bunch of different trials, mainly because for a number of reasons. The study duration was less than 1 year, duplicate articles, because usually they have multiple researchers that do the search, and then they do it independently to create less bias. And then they come together and eliminate the ones that they both found, or all three of them found, or all four of them found. So they end up doing that. It's not in the population of interest. There's a number of different exclusion criteria that they agree to before they go do this search. And they don't do it's not like they open every single one of the 39,000 studies. That would take them years for them to go through every single one of those studies. So they just look at the title and the abstract just to get an idea. Okay, this is related to GLP-1, let's include it, and then they end up excluding it after the fact, after some discussion, some debate between the researchers. They mentioned, so the excluded articles were also not randomized trials, so we want randomized controlled trials. We're not looking for associative trials of any sort. They didn't have particular subgroup analyses. I'm not going to go into exactly what that is. There's some complexity that just doesn't add anything to what we're talking about. It's not an original research article. I mean, there's a number of different reasons as to why more duplicate articles that they ended up removing. And ultimately, they ended up landing on roughly 45 trials. So with those 45 trials, they had, although it says here, to be honest, I'm a little confused because it says 45 trials here and then 17 here plus 30 here. So that would be not 45, that would be 47. So I'm not entirely sure. This might be a typo, not sure. Anyway, 17 trials were GLP-1 receptor agonists or GLP-1 agonists versus placebo, which is an inert substance. And then the other one is GLP-1 agonists versus different medicines. We're talking about like metformin, TDZ, and like a bunch of other diabetic medications to see if you compare it against placebo, which is the more pure comparison, what is the effect? And if you compare it against other medications, how does it stack up? So we're going to be able to look at both of those. Okay, so let's start out with weight. Again, I've covered this before, and I've covered this in far more depth in previous videos. But for the time being, let's just go over quickly how to read this. So I'm going to go over this one time, how to read it, how to read this data, because we're going to be looking over a lot of this kind of stuff. And then just keep that in mind as we go forward. All right, so we've got the source, which is all the studies. So these are the study names, Rewind, Pioneer 4, Leader, etc. So that's the study names. Then we've got the mean difference. So they calculate the difference in effect between the placebo. In this situation, the control here is the placebo group versus the intervention group, which is taking GLP-1 agonists. So they're comparing one group of people that are taking placebo. They think they're taking GLP-1 agonists, and the other group is literally taking GLP-1 agonists, but they don't know that they're taking GLP-1 agonists. So it eliminates a lot of bias that may be introduced. So when they compare the end results and they subtract the numbers from, let's say, the placebo number from the GLP-1 agonist number, so in terms of weight loss, then we get a mean difference. So that's what they're looking at here. So if anything is minus here, it indicates that there's greater weight loss in favor of the intervention, meaning that there's greater weight loss in favor of GLP-1 agonists. So these are the results from each one of these studies, the actual numbers on the left here. And what we see here on the right is what are known as 95% confidence intervals. So this number right here on the left is a best estimate of the true mean, or the best estimate of the true result of this study. Okay. So I just want you to think of it like the statistics gave the best stab. So this is where they indicate the effect is. That's the estimated effect is here. So minus 5.6 kilograms. But in reality, there's some uncertainty about where the true effect really is. And that's where this line here indicates, which is a representation of the 95% confidence interval. So it could actually be, maybe minus 6 instead of minus 5.6, or maybe it's minus 4.1, or it can be as low as minus 3.36, or it can be as high as low as minus 7.84. It falls somewhere in there. But the point is that they're all minus. So they are firmly saying that there is a decrease in weight, at least according to this DeRosa 2013 study, that there's definitely a drop compared to the placebo. Okay, so that's how to read these confidence intervals. That's how to read the difference in the mean. And then we've got this representation. This is all representing this data right here, just in non-numerical terms. So if you're more of a visual learner, you can just quick hop on over here and just look at these values. So this line here is an indication of 0. So it indicates there's no advantage for intervention or for control. In this case, the control is placebo, just to remind you. And then if it moves, if all these boxes, which are a representation of the value, the effect that was determined by this mean difference for each study, if it moves to the left, that's in favor of GLP-1 agonists. And if it's to the right, then it's in favor of placebo, meaning that people gained weight on GLP-1 agonists. Okay, so that's each one of the individual studies with their confidence intervals. As you can see, some of them are really small, some of them are really large. And then we've got a main effects or an overall effects diamond, which essentially takes all this data and puts it into one diamond to indicate what's the overall effect once you account for everything put together. And the width of this diamond is also an indication of the confidence intervals themselves. Okay, so that's the overall effect here. And then another few areas that I should point out is heterogeneity. You don't need to know all these different numbers, but I'll quick go over them anyway. So heterogeneity is essentially, so this is usually done by what's known as a Higgins test. So a Higgins test is indicating what is the difference in the results between each one of these studies. So obviously if they're all on one line, then there's zero heterogeneity because all the results indicate the exact same effect. So the heterogeneity would be 0. However, as we can see, we've got one value over here, we've got one value over here, we've got one value over here. They're all over the place. So the Higgins test indicates a 95% heterogeneity, which is very high heterogeneity. Now, there's a number of different reasons for that. I'm not going to go into all the different reasons for why that might be, but there are a number of different reasons for that. It doesn't invalidate the study or anything, but there's certain considerations that a person might want to make. And then we can determine, so they also run statistics on the heterogeneity as a whole. And if this value is below 0.05, then that indicates that it is statistically significant, indicating that there is statistically significantly determined heterogeneity between the studies. So it's just something to keep an eye on, but I'm not doing quite as good of justice as I probably should if you were to take like a statistics course and understand really what the implications of heterogeneity are. Now, finally, looking for the test of overall effect. So remember, we've got our overall effect right here, minus 1.84, but we also need to do the statistics on it. So we're not just basing it off this number or just looking at the diamond. We also need to determine, statistically speaking, is this statistically significantly different? And again, the cutoff is usually 0.05. So anything below that would indicate, yes, it is statistically significantly different. The z-score here is what feeds into the p-value. You don't need to really know that. Just focus on the statistical test and look at some of these numbers as well. So that is how to read this kind of data, and we're going to be looking over a good amount of it. So just keep that kind of stuff in mind, and certainly come back to this if you need a refresher. Okay, that all said, we can look at all the individual studies here. They're all negative, which indicate that they're all in favor of intervention. You can see that all the boxes are towards the left, except for maybe this one, but even that one is technically negative. It's just minus 0.03, so it just looks like it's just smack dab on zero, but it's slightly leaning towards left. We just can't see it with much granularity. If we look at the overall effect, they indicate minus 1.84 kilograms lost on intervention. It is statistically significant, so there is weight loss with GLP-1 agonists compared to placebo. But I suppose that's not a huge shock, considering that so many people talk about anecdotes in relation to GLP-1 agonists use. All right, next, let's go over heart rate. So again, we're reading it the exact same way. So I'm going to blast through this just to get through so much of the data that we have. We can see that everything moves in favor of control. What this actually truly means is that there's higher heart rate on the intervention, meaning that there's lower heart rate in the control or placebo condition. So GLP-1 agonists jack up heart rate, not massively, but a little bit. So, and we can see that is definitely the case. The overall effects diamond is in favor of control. We can see that the effect is 2.22, which is pretty mild, but still it is apparent, and it is statistically significant. Now, there's, again, high levels of heterogeneity, but again, I'm not going to bog this conversation now with too much on heterogeneity, which is a whole nother topic. Then if we look at systolic blood pressure, we see that it seems like all the studies are in favor of lowering systolic blood pressure. We see that it drops minus 1.75 is the overall effect. We see that it is statistically significant. We see that there's moderate heterogeneity in these, so you can see that they're a little bit closer together, kind of along the same line, but it is statistically significant as well. So systolic blood pressure goes down, heart rate goes up. Then LDL cholesterol, so low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is the cholesterol that is contained in these lipoproteins, these vessels. So this is technically they're measuring the actual cholesterol itself inside these lipoproteins. They're not measuring the actual lipoprotein number themselves, but we're looking at the overall cholesterol that's being circulated throughout the body in these LDL vessels. And what we find is that, one, they only have 5 studies included here. And you can see that they largely fall in favor of intervention, so lower levels of LDL with GLP-1 agonists, except for this Harmony 2 study seems to be a little bit more towards in favor of the placebo. But it also, I didn't mention this earlier, but the really small diamond or really small square indicates that there were not very many. The overall weight of the study is very low, meaning that it has very little bearing on the overall analysis. So the biggest studies all move in favor of GLP-1 agonists, and we can see that it is statistically significant. So there's an overall effect. The effect is pretty small, though, so it's not anything too dramatic. And there is no heterogeneity, at least based off of the Higgins test, and the p-value is 0.8. HbA1c, which is a long-term measure of diabetes. Well, again, we can look at, they have a number of different studies included in this, and the reason why they have more here compared to some of the others, well, not all the studies look at every single measure, so they include what studies that they can. And here we see that, again, the diamond seems to move in favor of intervention, so it seems to be moving in favor of GLP-1 agonists, and which confirms a lot of why people take GLP-1 agonists for diabetes, in that it drops blood sugar levels. So we see a minus 0.67 drop in HbA1c, which is pretty substantial when you're talking about HbA1c. which HbA1c would be like on a metric of, let's say, like 6.4 or 6.8 or 5.6, depending on where you fall. So getting a 0.67 drop is pretty substantial. And there is high level of heterogeneity, so keep that in mind. But it is statistically significant, so this is most likely a real effect. Okay, now that was all compared against placebo. Now what I'd like to do is return back to HbA1c and look over the comparison versus a number of other drugs. So we're not looking at just placebo here. So we're actually not looking at placebo anymore. We're looking at actual active ingredients. So we're looking at favors intervention is the GLP-1 agonist versus control. The control in this situation is DPP-4 inhibitors. So it should say DPP-4I. So remember, DPP-4 is this. So if we can inhibit, let me go to this one. If we can inhibit DPP-4, or this DPP protein, then we get less breakdown of the endogenous, the naturally produced GLP-1. So if you produce GLP-1, then it will stay in your system longer. So it's not actually forcing the production of more GLP-1 or adding the synthetic version of GLP-1 like the GLP-1 agonists, but it is keeping what we produce in our system for longer. So that's the idea behind DPP-4. Then obviously insulin addition, metformin, sulfonylureas, which is another way of lowering blood sugar. TZDs are kind of an outdated, at least from my reading, TZDs tend to have more side effects. So there are fewer studies that actually use TZDs anymore, but it's another way of reducing blood sugar, but with additional side effects. And then they had some studies that used a variety of them all in combination. So they included those as well. Okay, so that all said, we've got these different measures for each one. So versus DPP-4s, we see that overall the effect is yes, most likely there's an effect. Now they don't actually include, which is a drawback of this study, they don't actually include the statistical analysis for just this subgroup. And they should. It would be nice for them to add the statistical analysis just for this subgroup, because right now what I'm doing is I'm sort of letting my bias or my eyes determine if this truly is an effect. But that said, I mean, if you have every single study in favor of intervention, what are the odds that it's not statistically significant? Probably just about zilch. So it is in favor of GLP-1 agonists outperform DPP-4 inhibitors. Also largely the same for insulin, so maybe not quite as dramatic of an effect. You have 2 studies that are in favor of insulin use, but every other study is in favor of GLP-1 agonists. In this case, you've got 1 study looking at metformin, so heterogeneity is not applicable because heterogeneity, again, is comparing between studies. And since you have 1 study, you can't really compare it against itself because it's going to be a 0% heterogeneity. So they say it's not applicable. And they find that just off this 1 study, so it's not really a meta-analysis in this situation, you're just looking at 1 study, it seems like it still favors GLP-1 agonists over metformin. And then sulfonylureas, we see that 3 studies are in favor of yes, it is in favor of GLP-1 agonists. And 2 studies, remember the confidence intervals indicate the uncertainty. So the true value may actually still be in favor of GLP-1 agonists, or it may be further in favor of the sulfonylureas. So we don't actually know that, but the uncertainty there leads the overall effect plus the 3 studies in favor leads to largely what seems like an effect in favor of GLP-1 agonists. And then TZDs, again, we're dealing with this single study, and it seems to actually be in favor of the TZDs over GLP-1 agonists. But again, we only have 1 study for that conclusion. Then for the combination of a number of different ones, we don't actually know what that combination is, but a number of different drugs. And it seems like GLP-1 agonists far outperform any combination of the 2. But again, it's only 2 studies. Now, all of these considered, all of these combined, so taking DPP-4 inhibitors, insulin, metformin, all this stuff, TZD, all that stuff, the overall effect, this is where they do apply a statistical test, the overall effect is in favor of intervention. So it's in favor of GLP-1 agonists. So the overall effect is a drop in HbA1c in favor of GLP-1 agonists. There is significant heterogeneity, so it is statistically significant. And the overall effect is, yes, there is a statistically significant effect of this diamond is truly a statistically significant effect. All right, let's go over just a single piece of data from the exact same study. So we're still going to be looking at study 223. Let me pull up my notes here. Yeah, 223, and we're going to be looking at mortality now. And for that, we just need to look at one chart. So they've got a number of different studies involved here. They've got some additional information here in that they're showing the control versus the intervention. They're actually showing the actual number of people that suffered from, well, mortality, death. So number of people that died in each group over at least a year of being on GLP-1 agonists versus, in this case, placebo. And so as an example, let's look at the ELIXA study. We've got 223 people that died out of 3,034 total. We've got 211 that died with GLP-1 agonists out of 3,034 total. And then you can read this the exact same way that we've been reading it since the beginning. You can do this for every single one of these studies. Then they've got the overall amount of people that died in the control, the placebo group, 2,165 out of 29,255. And the GLP-1 agonists had 1,927 out of 30,071 individuals. Now, the overall effect in this situation then is a movement to the left in favor of intervention, and the relative risk drop is about 10-11%. So the relative risk reduction in risk of mortality from GLP-1 agonists is about 10 or 11%. So not huge, but again, you're also only talking about a year, maybe a few years of time. So you're not talking about massive changes over time. Now, that is relative risk. I'll go over absolute risk as well. I've calculated those. So 7.3% of people died in the control, and 6.4% of people died in the GLP-1 agonist, roughly 6.4%. So the absolute benefit, so the comparison between the two, the absolute benefit over a minimum of 1 year is just shy of 1% benefit. Now, when you think of that, I always have to remind people that we're talking about, so a lot of these, like looking at mortality, for example, these are long-standing effects. These are things that grow a lot more over time. So the difference between the two is right now very small, but as time goes on, the separation between the two continues to increase over time. So the relative risk looks more impressive in a short period of time, but if you look at the absolute risk, it doesn't look that impressive. But come back 20 years down the road, then you start to really see absolute risks really starting to show more and more of an impact. Now, that is how to really think about absolute risk and relative risk. There's, of course, a lot more to it than that, but this is, I just want to make people aware, because anytime you look at absolute risk, it's almost always going to be much lower than relative risk. But that's because you're not taking into account the time component. Always think about the time component. I can't stress that enough. Okay. Now, the test for overall effect here, it is statistically significant. There's no heterogeneity. The studies were relatively consistent with one another. You've got some that are more to the left, more to the right, sure, but their confidence intervals are also really, really wide. So the studies that are really strong tend to be smack down the middle, or seem to be in congruence. Okay, let's go over side effects. So I don't actually have any. Let me remove myself here real quick. All right, so when we're talking about side effects, I'm going to list off a few of the different side effects that were presented in these studies. And then I've got one more thing that I have to say on the effect that it has on muscle. Okay, so when it comes to side effects, the most prominent side effects were two. There were two main side effects. One, nausea. Two, vomiting. And that's not a huge shock considering that GLP-1 agonists are going to have a direct effect on your stomach. And especially if you're going to be blocking that pyloric sphincter, just slowing it down from opening, then you're going to have more food that's going to be stuck in there. And vomiting, obviously. Again, if you're not used to it, that's why the physicians usually will start it out at a lower dose and then slowly build it up, because you need to get used to having that GLP-1 agonist in your system. So those are the two most common, but there were other side effects as well. So diarrhea is another one. Constipation is another one. Headache. Decreased appetite. Not exactly sure why they put this as a side effect, considering that is a direct effect of GLP-1 agonists, but they wrote it down anyway. Dyspepsia, as well as abdominal pain. So these are all the different side effects that were listed across most of these studies. However, I would like to point out that there have been some stories or clinicians have also pointed out that potentially it could lead to muscle loss. There is no evidence up to this point that there is such muscle loss on GLP-1 agonists. Now, I need to be clear here because people sometimes jump down my throat and say, well, I experienced it. It's like, I'm not trying to invalidate your experience or anything like that. One, I'll just say that's not a controlled setting. So your experience is not a controlled setting. These studies are far more controlled settings, but still, let's assume that that is the case, that GLP-1 agonists lead to muscle loss because they lead to significant weight loss. We simply don't have the data for it yet. So considering Physionic is based on studies, I simply can't afford to say, oh yeah, it leads to muscle loss, because I have no proof of that. I'm not a clinician. That is one of the weaknesses that's not what I do. I do studies. So the data so far up to this point, until a study releases looking specifically at muscle loss, which I looked at a bunch of studies for GLP-1 agonists, I didn't find any that looked at muscle loss. Until that data comes out, all I can say right now is that there is no data on muscle loss. I'm not going to say that it doesn't happen, but I also can't sit here and agree with all the anecdotes and say, oh, well, it does happen, because that's not a science-based mindset. So until we have more data, I simply can't speak on it. But for the time being, these are the side effects. I would argue that they're relatively mild, but again, you may completely disagree. If you absolutely despise vomiting more than anything, and there's some people that really do despise vomiting more than anything, then that is a deal breaker for you. Okay, so the midpoint conclusion here is that GLP-1 agonists reduce body weight, blood sugar, blood lipoproteins, so that's LDL, and blood pressure, even when compared against some medications. That was the DPP-4 inhibitors, the metformin, the insulin, all that stuff. And additionally, GLP-1 agonists reduce overall mortality risk. And remember the comparison between relative and absolute risk. Now, if you're a Physionic insider, we're going to be continuing on to GLP-1 agonists on heart disease. It affects on liver disease and kidney disease, as well as oxidative stress, inflammatory conditions, and a few others as well. So if you're interested in that, then hop on over to the insider version of this content, which you'll just be subscribed to the Physionic Insiders. I'll have that linked for you. And without further ado, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something. Hopefully you got something out of it. And I'll hope to speak with you in the next one. Have a good one. Bye.